Okay, everyone, so now we're going to get into some of the different types of economies that we have out there that do exist today. Now, there are lots of different types when you can kind of combine them, if you will, and we'll talk about that later. But we're going to kind of give a couple broad definitions of a few of them and then look a little bit deeper. So the two I'm going to talk about today are communism and traditional economies. And as you can see with communism, has a little bit of issues, but we'll talk about it. Now, a traditional economy is an economy that you're going to see in a variety of different places in the world. And as I have here, you have use of resources and other economic activity stems from ritual, habit, or custom. Basically means hundreds, if not even 1,000 years ago, they determined, quote unquote, how they're going to do things. And it's pretty much been the same ever since. And the aspect of that is individuals don't really have the ability to make free decisions. If you see this little boy on the left, you see he's herding cattle, which means his father probably herded cattle. And the woman on the right is making pottery, so her family probably made pottery. That's just kind of how it is. And it was developed way back when that, you know, to survive. But after that, it's going to get a little dicey. Now, there are some advantages of it. Everyone has an assigned role. Like, you don't have to try to figure out what you want to do in life, and some people kind of like that. All those economic questions that I introduced in the last video, they are kind of already accounted for. And I will say that this can work fairly well in small tribal groups. That's something that you can see where people kind of work together and they're all supporting each other. Now, the disadvantages are kind of high. It often leads to economic stagnation. There are too many strict rules and it discourages new ideas. And in the end, you often have low standards of living and relatively high levels of poverty in this area, kind of depending on what's going on, because it doesn't want new things. So you don't have a lot of technological develop. That second question of how to make things, it's always been done this way and we're not going to do it any other type of new way. And that's not good. Basically, most economies, if they're going to be successful, should have the ability to change, should have the ability to adapt. And when you get that, there's a lot of excitement and economies can get better. Unfortunately, when you don't have it, it can kind of fall apart. And so for the most part, we don't see traditional economies in a lot of places. In class, I'll talk to you about one of the things that we do get from it that's actually pretty good. But in the end, it's just not something that can give you high yields. Then you have one of the more famous types of economic systems in the world, which is a command economy, okay? Better known as communism. Now, in a command economy, the central authority or the government makes all the decisions, okay? The government has all the power. There really isn't private business, and in many cases, there isn't much in the way of private property. And I have this example here of that the government wants to build houses or apartments, so they decide to build houses or apartments, then they decide how they're going to build them, and the type that they make, they determine who can even get them. Again, there's not a lot of private property, food and some small things. You don't have a lot of job opportunities in the sense that they determine what kind of workers they want. So if they're not looking for engineers, then if you want to be an engineer, there's not a lot of opportunities to do that. Today, there are only two real nations that are communist. China and Vietnam are what I like to call communist, kind of, sort of. And but really it's Cuba and North Korea. In the past, you had the Soviet Union, much of Eastern Europe, certain nations in Africa and Vietnam and other areas, but in the end, there's just not a tremendous amount of those present. And if you know anything about Cuba and North Korea, those are two nations that have pretty weak economies. So the question is, why have so many nations had communism in the past? Well, there are some advantages to communism, to be completely honest with you. There are no economic classes. In other words, the idea of communism was created by this guy, Karl Marx, was that he didn't like the idea that you had people that are wealthy and not, and there's economic discrimination, and we definitely have that today, and we'll be talking about it in a future video, and we'll talk about it in class. But and in many ways that's not good. Look at the discrimination against the poor, and if you don't have much money, look at the lack of opportunities you often have. So on the outside, it's a good idea, and you can also specifically allocate resources. Like if you're in charge, you can say, Stalin in the 1930s was like, we're going to become a powerful industrial country in Russia, and they did. And China made a decision to focus on like clothing and other manufacturing, and they were successful. And in many cases, most of these types of nations, at least on the outside, will offer and provide health care and public services as well. However, there are a lot of negatives here, and as you can see here, freedom is going to kind of be one of them. It often ignores the wants and needs of the consumers, okay? They being the federal government, are going to decide what they want, and consumers, you don't really get a choice in the matter. What this has led to is often organized crime. If you remember, for those of you from US 2, that organized crime developed because we made liquor illegal. I mean, it was around, but exploded during that. So the problem was there were lots of things that people actually want. However, they didn't have the opportunity to get them because the government deemed them unnecessary. So organized crime developed. So for instance, in the Soviet Union, it's estimated that anywhere from like 25 to 30% of the economy is run by the mob. Like, that's crazy, but that often happens. And there aren't really much in the way of incentives. When you live in a command economy, you are given a job, and that's just the way that it's going to be. And if I work really hard and guy B over there doesn't work really hard, well, we're both pretty much still going to get paid the same. So the economy often slows down because there's not a lot of, desire for people to work hard. You often need a very large decision-making bureaucracy as well because it's, well, we have to figure out this, and that, so it can often take a while. But the biggest thing that happens is that when you give a small group of people control of all the money, you're going to get dictatorship, corruption, and poverty. Because if I can have a whole lot of money for just me, please explain to me how I'm supposed to give it up to everyone else. Yes, it's nice on the outside, and theoretically, we're all citizens in one nation, and we're going to work together, and we're going to support each other. But the fact of the matter, in a realistic matter, it doesn't occur. Everybody, the federal government has control of all the money, and eventually they become dictatorial. This has happened every single time. Now, not that there isn't a good or that there aren't good possibilities for a federal government to run certain things. We'll talk about that. It can really do well. But if you put it all in the hands of the federal government, you're just gonna have a problem, and it just doesn't work. So we see with traditional and command economies, there's potential there. There's chances for some good things to happen, but in the end, they're just not effective. They don't work in the real world. They don't work with people's goals and what they want to do, and that's why in the end, these economies, in their pure forms, are very, very ineffective. All right, so make sure you get comments and questions as always, and we'll talk about this in class. See you guys.